People like to talk about how far the game industry has come in terms of telling dark and mature stories and having very serious gameplay. But while a lot of these people seem to like their kindergarten games, stuff like Call of Duty, Valorant, League of Legends, Five Nights at Freddy's, and even stuff like The Last of Us 2, for today's Scroll Thought, we're talking about the real dark games. Titles with plot descriptions like, do you want to sell a kid to be brutally tortured? Do you want your arm chopped off? And other things that is making the YouTube algorithm doing that man blinking meme right now. If there's one area where the indie scene has truly elevated and gone far and beyond anything any other studio could do, it is on the topic of dark and mature storytelling and dark and mature games. This is when we are not talking about games that are meant to have a happy ending, or games that are meant to have these standard progression loops, gameplay systems. When we talk about the idea of player-centric design, in that game is supposed to be made so that anyone who picks up can play it, these games are 100% the opposite of that. And am I ever continuing to do everything backwards? Very recently, I went through and played Lisa the Painful. This would be after checking out Fear and Hunger 1 and 2. Now, both games are very far apart in terms of their design, storytelling, and of course, when they were first released. But they both share some very interesting elements in common when it comes to the storytelling they're trying to employ and how that relates to the gameplay in question. Both titles are turn-based RPGs. They're both games where you get into combat, you fight enemies one turn at a time, and hopefully you win or you lose. But where they both kind of separate themselves from other games is that this willingness to, I guess for lack of a better term, just really hurt the player, both emotionally and from a gameplay point of view. Now, in the emotional side, both games have incredibly dark stories, very mature depictions of things, even more so in Fear and Hunger 1 and 2. And in my lovely little window up there, you're not going to be seeing any of that, because YouTube will probably flag this video with all the flags possible if I show some of the more mature stuff in that game. And with Lisa the Painful, it is a game that deals heavily in the topics of toxic masculinity, depression, drug abuse, torture, and other things that, again, if I were to mention them, I would get in trouble. And it's with these aspects of the stories where both the Lisa games and Fear and Hunger have cultivated a dedicated fan base that you are literally not going to find another developer and another studio who's probably going to put out a game like Fear and Hunger 2. And again, some of the things shown in that game, we would get into a lot of trouble if they were to be posted here. And one of the things that really elevated Lisa the Painful, and now with the Definitive Edition, again, is a story that we really don't see a lot of people talk about. And this, again, has been something that has grown a lot out of the independent space. That you can tell a story that is not going to be happy, that, the main character is not going to succeed at the end, or deal with very trigger warning inducing topics that, again, we won't be covering too much in this video. But this raises one of the challenges of making a dark game. There's a very fine line between telling a dark story and telling a nihilistic story, where every single bad thing is happening all at once and there is no hope, no happiness. It is just pain on top of pain on top of pain. And this is oftentimes, not just in video games, but in any medium, that it becomes a very tough line to walk. How do we tell a story about, again, very sensitive topics without being seen like we are either glorifying it or we are condoning it? That it's okay to do something like in Fear and Hunger, or that we should laugh at something that's happening in Lisa the Painful. And I think for a lot of people who don't take a deeper look at these games, it's so easy to look at a game that has something that is very brutal, very trigger inducing, and just seeing the developer is happy to have that in it. And this definitely stems from, again, where video games have come and where they are today. Again, when we talk about the history of the video game market, up until the 2000s, it was still considered very much a children's toy. And it wasn't until the likes of Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear, and just the rise of 3D in general that we began to move away from the stigma of video games just being this cute little toy. And there are plenty of games out there that are family friendly. I'm sure if you be watching this have played stuff like Mario, like Fall Guys, and other happy-go-lucky games. If you have a family right now or children, don't let them play Lisa the Painful or Fear and Hunger, because that will probably scar them. And this is again where we get into this challenge of making dark games. A dark game, no matter how popular it is, how many awards it wins, stuff like that, it is not going to be a mass market success. It will never be a mass market success, just by the nature of it. And games like Lisa and Fear and Hunger are kind of fine with that. And it is one of those things you have to understand if you're building a game like this, that you need to be making this more on the art side than from a commercial or kind of business savvy side. And again, games like Lisa and Fear Hunger have gotten respectable fan bases and I'm sure have earned a decent amount of income. But I don't think they're going to be beating Undertale or Smash Brothers or Call of Duty anytime soon. And speaking of Call of Duty and military shooters, we all remember the controversy surrounding Spec Ops: The Line and its infamous white phosphorus scene. And this is kind of one of the main through lines of our discussion, that when you play a dark game, you're not supposed to be, I guess, enjoying it in the same way as other titles. When we play Mario or we play Zelda, we're supposed to be smiling as Mario is jumping through the air or Link is fighting monsters or building mechs, I think that's in the newest one. We're not supposed to be smiling when we are fighting the likes of strange creatures in Fear and Hunger, or when we have to make one of the many painful choices in Lisa the Painful. And it does require a different mindset about that. And speaking of, let's talk about the other side of a dark game, and that is the gameplay side. And this is the one area where specifically major studios really do not want to tread. One of the things I talked about in my upcoming book on RPG design was the rise of morality-based systems. Light side, dark side, good, evil, whatever you want to call it. And the problem that those games had was that it tried to gamify morality in a way that it just came off as being hollow. To this day, I still think BioShock 1 was an immensely overrated game. And part of that was the whole just decision, not a decision, of dealing with the little sisters and big daddies. That it's not a real choice if you're trying to make the player argue between get a few stuff now or get a lot more stuff later that's going to help you. And you can't have choice in this way only be a factor in the story. This is again why games like Fear and Hunger and Lisa really do an exemplary job of this kind of very dark, very polarizing gameplay. That it's not just a choice between, hey, do you want 500 experience points now or 2,000 experience points later? It's, do you want to sacrifice a party member? Or do you want this character to rip off your legs and arms, and you'll have to spend the rest of your game just as a head and a torso? And these are elements that they resonate with the player because they are permanent choices. And more importantly, they are permanent choices that affect the gameplay around them. As a very quick or brief spoiler for Lisa the Painful, your very first hard choice in that game is to decide to give up your first party member and your friend, or have the bad guys literally take every item you own. And this is just one of many of these kinds of choices. And it's one that, again, not only does it represent the dark nature of the world, but it represents a very important gameplay consideration. I like having all my items, but having another teammate is kind of important in a party-based RPG. And again, this goes far beyond just having a they will remember it, or you gain 5 light side points, or people will, like you 2% more. If you have to make a choice that is going to permanently affect your save file for the rest of that play, you're going to have to think about that a lot more. And one of the other points about this is that, of course, in games like these, you can save scum, unless you're playing Lisa the Painful on a painful difficulty. But it's still this idea that your choice is really going to matter. And getting that part through to the player can be very difficult, just as getting them to play these games. People often don't want to play a game that has them wondering, well, is my character going to lose a leg in the next room? Am I going to die of hunger, thirst, being strangled? And again, many other words that will get YouTube's algorithm on me really fast. And it is, again, this tough line to walk when you're marrying that with gameplay. How many people like to play a game where their party members can be physically abused or mentally abused and can end up dying, or even sometimes worse situations that can happen to them? There's a few paths in Fear and Hunger that don't exactly end all happily ever after in that game. And it is something you have to really understand as a designer, that there has to be a balance. No matter how dark your game may be, you still need to give the player something. There has to be a kind of safety net to help them get through this. Fear and Hunger has this in the number of ways that you can break that game. People who have gotten really good at both Fear and Hungers, they can crush that game once they get the basic elements of a run going. In Lisa the Painful, you are given a lot of party members, and there are some very game-breaking strategies, or kind of game-balancing strategy if you're going after the super hard content, that will allow you to get through it. You don't want to just, again, be just an ever insurmountable pile-on of pain and misery. And this is something that we see from, I think, a lot of lesser developers or first-timers, who they tell the story that feels like just like a art house movie of everything just being brutal. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no possible way that this is going to turn out even 1% well. And again, while there may be an audience for that, it kind of, again, gets into this point of, are you telling a dark story because you have something interesting to say? Or are you just telling a dark story because you're trying to be polarizing, or you're trying to make a very infamous game? And we saw that with something like Hatred, which, how many people even remember that game? It had a huge amount of buzz and, of course, negative press when it was announced and people were learning about it. But then it just kind of came and went. While meanwhile, games like Lisa the Painful went on to be one of the more standout RPG Maker games. It's had, surprisingly, a lot of fan games made after. It has resonated with a lot of people because it has more to tell than just saying, here's a horrible experience that you're going to hate yourself after how many hours you play it. So to wrap things up for today's critical thought, dark games, very polarizing games, are oftentimes very tough to walk. You have to be a really great game designer and a really great storyteller in order to make this work. If your kind of, height of your story is just, this is bad, that's not really telling anything that people haven't already known. You have to explore it in a unique way, and you also have to make that representative of the gameplay. And that is, again, something that Lisa the Painful and Fear and Hunger have done very well. That all this is wrapped up not just in the story it's trying to tell, but the gameplay is trying to evoke. But if you're just making a generic action game or a generic RPG, but the story has these just horrifically triggering topics and scenes in them, then it just feels like you're just trying to sensationalize your game. That you're not really telling anything new. You're just saying, okay, here's this horrible thing. Now let's get back to the action, and we'll just never talk about it again. And this is why it takes a very clever designer and a very restrained designer to do this right. That there has to be kind of, again, light in the darkness for this to work. And if your story just ends, well, everyone had a horrible experience and everyone's now dead, it kind of cheapens what you're trying to do. So with that said, for those of you watching this, can you think, and without, of course, getting us into a lot of trouble with YouTube, of games that have done darkness right? And again, it's not just about showing something that is horrible or having something bad happen to a character, but making it resonate with the gameplay and allowing the player to kind of explore that space of what it means from a storytelling perspective. Let me know in the comments down below. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to do the YouTubing stuff people tell you to do. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my books wherever they are sold. Visit our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games.